This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me again this morning John Rubino, well-recognized author and publisher of the website dollarcollapse.com and author of a number of books. Good morning, John, and best of the season to you.
Good morning, Gordon. Happy holidays.
John, I said a number of books. How many?
4 altogether. The most recent one that's applicable to what we're going to talk about is the collapse of the dollar and how to profit from it, which was co-written with Gold Money's James Turk.
Have you got a new book on the horizon?
We're talking about a couple, and they haven't come to fruition yet, but hopefully in the next year or so, I'll be working on something that's covering what's going on now in the market. So the things we're going to talk about, because there's a lot of stuff going on right now to talk about.
Well, John, what I wanted to do this morning was to recap some of the ideas that we've been discussing in 2012. I don't know if you realize it, and it was a surprise to me. This is our 22nd session this year, and each one has averaged well over 30 slides. So we've done close to 700 slides and close to 10 hours of viewing. So picking the highlights of what we can talk about here this morning in 2012 was a big job, I can tell you that. And what I thought was, really it just distills down to some key messages that are worth reinforcing that come out. And they are, it starts with living within our means. It's the critical importance of sound money. The maintenance of money as a true store of value, the moral decay that begins to happen when we veer from these, what I'll consider financial tenets, but they're not. They're societal tenets and what happens with it, and the inevitable and unavoidable conclusions it unfortunately all leads to. I have up some of the key points I was hoping that we could touch on this morning, and every one of these we've done minimum 2 shows on, some a series of. And the one I wanted to start off with, in the roadmaps that we've done, and I've done with Ty and Charles, and we've touched on from central planning through to statism, is how at the core of it, as you get into central planning, is the reasons for central planning, why it happens. And out of it, what led a lot of our discussions were global imbalances and what was happening in the globe and the complexity that was leading to it, and something that you were referring to as authoritarian state. More thoughts on that today?
To understand where we are now, we should begin at the beginning, which for our purposes is 1971. And that's when the U.S. cut the last remaining link between the dollar and gold. And since the dollar was the world's reserve currency at the time, that basically gave us an unlimited credit card. We could borrow as much as we wanted from the rest of the world, and we didn't have to prioritize. We could buy whatever we wanted with newly created dollars. And as a result, over the next 4 decades, we've built up a military empire that's bigger than the next 17 military budgets combined. It costs us about $1 trillion a year. And we've created an entitlement/welfare state that costs us another $1 trillion a year. And we've created a consumer culture here in the U.S. that glorifies buying now and paying later, which leads us to borrow huge amounts of money from the rest of the world and live beyond our means year after year after year. So now we owe China and Japan several $1 trillion, and we've become the world's biggest debtor nation. And the imbalance that the U.S. is creating is reflected in other imbalances around the world. We're the biggest debtor nation, which makes other countries creditor nations on a scale that they probably didn't anticipate and have trouble handling. And so the world is dramatically out of balance now. And governments tend to respond to situations where there's a big imbalance and it's creating a threat by becoming more and more authoritarian. They try to intervene and force people to behave in one way or another as a way of protecting the system from spinning out of control. And so you get a bigger and more powerful government at every level telling us what to do. And that's one of the unintended consequences of fiat currency, of being able to borrow as much as you want and print as much as you want. And in the U.S. especially now, but also in the rest of the world, things have spun even further out of control in the last few years. The U.S. has run 4 straight years of trillion-dollar deficits, and our total debt, which was about 1.5 times GDP in 1980, is now about 3.5 times GDP. And if you add up all the debt in the U.S. system, it comes to about $700,000 per family of 4, which is already, we're already toast. You can't cover that kind of debt on what the average U.S. family makes. But that's a false number. If we calculate U.S. debt correctly, in other words, the way a private sector company would have to calculate its debt, the actual debt in the U.S. per family of 4 is more like $2 million. So we are so far down the path towards monetary destruction that there's really no coming back in a painless way. And that leads us to all the unintended consequences that we'll talk about today. And the biggest of which is a growing police state in the U.S. We're very close to the tipping point where our debt causes us to spin out of control, and the government is getting more and more oppressive and more authoritarian in order to protect what it sees as our birthright, what the system that's been built up and benefits the elites in the U.S. And so we are becoming less and less free, less and less rich, and we're doing so at an accelerating rate, and that's how we're entering 2013.
John, what I see with this growth in authority, it's not only the major countries in the G7, but all of the smaller countries are being forced into it. As you pointed out, you've got hot money flowing, coming because the G7's rate at which they're printing money, and it's flowing into these countries, and therefore they've got to do something about it. It starts with capital controls that they start to put in. It forces them to take on more and more control and power, whether they wanted it or not, or whether it's an excuse to do it. And it clearly, I would believe, accelerating. But what it is to me is there's a separate point, is complexity and size that actually comes with this globalization. And what it does is it leads to and it requires more coordination. That can be expected, but we seem to confuse coordination with control. And therefore these governments, to try and handle these growing problems, think they need more control to be able to exercise it. And the systems are terribly fragile. They're untested, and because of the rate at which globalization's happened, and they're not robust. And that means anything that can happen, and it will happen. Bad things can cascade quickly out of control. And I think that's the kind of fear that these governments have, we all as individuals have, and I think it's becoming more and more prevalent.
Well, that takes us to the idea of complex systems analysis, which is crucial to understand today's world. Most policymakers think they're dealing with linear systems where you move interest rates a notch in this direction, create a little extra money, and you get a predictable result within the economy. And that's what economics textbooks teach. And that's how policymakers behave and believe right now. But it's actually not true. A financial system is really a complex system. It's more like a weather front where the different parts communicate with each other and change in response to that communication. And complex systems have some very specific characteristics that apply to financial systems. For instance, they run on exponentially greater amounts of energy as they get bigger. In other words, you have to create more debt at an accelerating rate to keep a highly indebted economy going. And they're prone to catastrophic collapse after a certain point. You build up a certain amount of complexity, and the system wants to fall apart, and you have to pump more and more debt, more and more currency into it to keep it from falling apart. And that's where we are now with the global financial system, with the U.S. in particular, but the rest of the world as well, where we're creating more and more currency and borrowing more and more money just to stay on the treadmill. And at some point, if the analytical framework of complex systems turns out to be true, the system will just spin out of control because it'll become so complex and so unwieldy that there's no policy that can possibly stop the system from spinning out of control.
John, I think it will actually fracture. I differentiate that in that it'll be sudden, abrupt, and cataclysmic. And I'm not trying to say the world is coming to an end, but my experience as an engineer with fragile systems is when they break, they cascade. And we've had warnings of that. And we've been able, on 2008, right on the precipice, to pull ourselves back. But that was one company. But this time, the amount of money that the central banks in going all in and fighting part of this super debt cycle that we've have taken us to a whole new level, because we have profound, unprecedented, and unproven changes, during the period that you and I have been doing macro analytics this year. As you point out, it has just raised it to another level.
The linchpin of all of this might be derivatives, because after the 2008-2009 collapse, you would have expected the derivatives market, which almost blew up, to be reined in one way or another. Either the market does or regulators do it, but that's not the case. The derivatives book of the big banks has gotten even bigger. And the too big to fail banks, which by the way are also growing instead of shrinking, report their derivatives as a net number. They take their longs and their shorts and they net them out and come up with a number that they claim illustrates their derivatives risk. But using complex system analysis, you wouldn't look at the net number, you'd look at the gross number. In other words, it's not Citigroup's and JP Morgan's derivatives that they hold that are counterparties with each other's netted out. It's how big is the derivatives book of the entire system, because that illustrates the complexity of the system. And that's growing. Depending on who's doing the calculating, we either have $700 trillion of notional value of derivatives out there or about a quadrillion. This dwarfs the size of the global economy. And even a tiny tremor in a market that big, 1 or 2% going bad, could create a cascade failure of the rest of the system. And that's a really easy thing to expect. There are very few markets that don't fluctuate by 3 or 4 or 5% in a given year. And for the derivatives market to do that on the gross notional value would be cataclysmic.
Actually, it's staggering that it hasn't already, John, because when we had the 2008 crisis, and the derivatives element that was really front and center at the time was the credit default swaps. That was about 60 to 70 trillion. But that 60 to 70 trillion is only part of 640 trillion total derivatives that's out there. The rest are interest rate and currency swaps. And with the interest rates at the rate where we're at today and the issues with currency and debasement, it is stunning that they haven't adjusted significantly. And I say that based on, as they move, you have to post more collateral, which begs many, many questions, because we're talking about a system here that's unregulated, offshore, off balance sheet, off market, and has no visibility, and is $640 trillion on a world economy that runs approximately $68 to $70 trillion with $200 trillion of debt out there. It is just staggering to me. I just put out a paper, John, and you may or may not have seen it, where I refer to it as the currency cartel, and those who are managing U.S. dollars in the fiat currencies, their currencies are tied to them. And what's telling to me is we just came out with a new report from a financial Stability Authority out of Basel, Switzerland, where Carney was running it, who's going to be the new Bank of England, and before him, Mario Draghi ran it. There's only 2 people that have ever run this very quiet and mysterious group. But anyway, they came out with a paper showing that the shadow banking system is now $67 trillion in the globe. And that is just staggering to me. And again, unpoliced. But what begged the question, John, it gets back to what we were talking about, that 67 trillion grew by nearly $7 trillion in 2011 when the world was deleveraging. How is that? How is that possible? And not only is it possible, there's only a very few people in the world that are allowed or apparently can see this. One of them is Carney, who is now suddenly moving from Canada to England to take over the Bank of England, and he hasn't even arrived, and he said we're going to start printing more money. Well, or at least he's going to go to the Evans rule.
This actually illustrates a good point here. Derivatives did blow up in 2008, and we had to borrow maybe 20 or 30 trillion new dollars over the course of the next 3 or 4 years worldwide in order to keep the system from falling apart. But instead of simplifying the system from then on, learning our lesson, we let it get even bigger and bigger. So the next blow up will be much more serious. And central banks are reacting to that, even though they're not explicitly telling us that's why they're doing what they're doing. But all the world's major central banks have gotten even easier in the meantime. You mentioned the Bank of England. Yeah, they're changing their mandate now, or talking about changing their mandate from just price stability to price stability and unemployment. And Japan just elected a new leader or is in the process of electing a new leader who is going to pressure the Bank of Japan to get even easier, to pump out even more money. The U.S. just announced that it was effectively doubling the size of the latest quantitative easing program. And the reason they're all doing this is because they're seeing the real numbers. Like you said, not very many people see what's really going on, but central banks of the world do. And they're terrified. They know that the system is getting closer and closer to some kind of catastrophic failure, and they're trying to liquefy in anticipation. And the other reason they're doing it, of course, is that you can't get reelected if there's high unemployment. And so they want to get as many people back to work as possible. And the idea is that maybe if a lot of people are working and paying taxes and creating wealth, that the system stabilizes and buys some time in which to pay off debt. But I think the numbers are so huge right now that that's probably impossible, but that's the policy option that's left for these guys. They're the only choice for them right now is to just let the system fall apart or to try to liquefy it and buy some time. And that's what they're doing, but it's an act of desperation, at least based on the numbers. They don't look fixable. They're so big, so catastrophically huge compared to the size of the global economy that no amount of money printing is going to stabilize things. And, it's much more likely that we cause some other kind of problem like prices spiking or interest rates spiking that sends us off a cliff than that we fix things this way.
With the amount of money printing that's been going on and financial repression of driving down interest rates, which we've been doing globally to right across the entire yield curve, not just the short end, but right out to the long end. So effectively negative real rates, pretty well right across the G7. What we've done is the amount of money that's come out, which has created the amount of leverage that it has to be there. So every time we have rollovers now, that they can be rollovers, there's enough liquidity, but the problem is the collateral that they're based on is no longer valid. It's falling and it's shrinking, but they're trying to keep it on the books at some elevated level. So, for example, if bonds went up, just interest rates go up, bond prices therefore falling, the collateral contagion that could implode is just staggering. So what we have effectively is a one-way ratchet, John. So we can't go up because we're so highly leveraged and have rolled over so much malinvestment and misinvestment that it would crumble. So we're now on a treadmill where we have to run faster and faster. And so if you notice, the quantitative easings of all of the countries are larger and quicker. I have charts that show that everyone's getting sooner. I mean, we just did QE3 in September, and we're here in December, and we're doing QE4. And it's the same, and they're becoming larger and larger. And the analogy it reminds me when I was a kid, and we used to play something called musical chairs. I don't know if you remember that little game, John. The rules were that, when the music stopped, you couldn't grab a chair, and there was always one too few chairs. You had to go stand against the wall. You got tagged out. And it was a fun game as it proceeded. Today, we don't tag you out. We print money. It's rolled over. So we should have unmitigated numbers of bankruptcies going on right now, John. We never see them. They don't exist. That's impossibility with the current state of affairs, but we paper them over. So back to my musical chairs. So if you don't tag out, what we say is we have one less chairs. We just have more people now jumping for the next chair. And then how does that game end? Well, what it ends up with is this massive crowd jumping on what is supposed to be that last chair. it crashes. There are no winners. There are only losers. And the whole system was false right from the get-go because the rules have been changed. And that may be a bad analogy, but that's what's going on.
Yeah, no, it's a good analogy, Gord. And the chairs represent different kinds of debt. And
Precisely.
Yeah, and so now we're at the point where we're converting all this other bad paper into government debt, in effect, by having the Federal Reserve and the other central banks buy mortgage paper and other, very crappy kinds of investments in return for newly created dollars. And so we're basically taking all this stuff onto the government balance sheet and, in effect, converting it into treasuries because now we, as taxpayers, have to pay it all off regardless. And that's really the last chair. If government debt were to become uninteresting to the market, then the game would be over. And so what's happening is we're running big deficits all around the world. We're creating more and more government debt to replace the private sector debt that's going bad. And that can go on as long as the currencies that we're creating in order to create this new debt or buy this new debt are considered valuable out in the world. So it all comes down to the value of the dollar and the yen and the euro. As long as these currencies are seen as stores of value and a good medium of exchange, then we can keep the game going. But as soon as people figure out that these currencies are really becoming the problem, we're really destroying the value of these currencies in order to prop up all of this huge edifice of debt that's out there, then the game is over. Because the governments won't be able to borrow anymore, won't be able to create any more currency because they won't be able to get anyone to take that currency in return for real stuff. And it's done. And, the day is out there. We don't know when it's going to happen, but the numbers are getting so big and the imbalances are getting so obvious that the time is obviously coming.
98% of the world's reserve currencies and the basis of the banking system all basically fall into either U.S. dollars, Japanese yen, the euro, or the British sterling. So as long as you have that kind of control in four currencies, as long as you work in a coordinated, concerted manner of bringing down your currencies together, and the way they come down is when you're debasing. So it's like a ring around the rosy when they announce quantitative easing. I can almost predict when the next one of those four is going to announce their next round. But what it is that coordinated debasement together. So what the trick, John, is unless you can figure out how to do off-world investing, you've got to invest in the world. You're really trapped into the game, and there's no other way to go. But there is another way to go. You can go to things such as gold and silver and other assets, but I'm looking at some of the shocks that hit this market out of nowhere that make absolutely no sense. I've got to believe there's some level of unmitigated manipulation going on. But if you try and find any other sources, and, of course, you and I have done discussions on China and the Asian tigers who are buying more and more gold. I was reading this morning, we've got Brazil have just dramatically increased their holdings here, doubled in the last 3 months, and Iraq have quadrupled its holdings in less than 3 months. So, just as examples. Even central banks of these other countries trying to get off-world investing and create their own right now. But it's this coordinated fashion that I believe of trying to fence in the game.
Yeah, well, you've got the developed world, mostly, the US, Europe, and Japan, all trying to prop up their paper currencies. And then you've got the rest of the world who's basically figured out what game the developed world is playing, and they're shifting out of dollars and euros and to an extent yen and into hard assets. And they're trying to do it in a way that doesn't draw too much attention to themselves because they don't want to spook the markets and then make the value of their existing remaining dollars go down dramatically. And China is the best example of this because they have cut the percentage of dollars in their foreign exchange reserves from 70-some% to 50-some% in the last few years. And at the same time, they've been buying a huge amount of gold. It looks like they're accumulating almost 1,000 tons of gold per year right now, which is a really big number because their official gold holdings is only about 1,000 tons. And they're doing that as part of a plan to diversify out of the major paper currencies and into real assets on the assumption that those real assets are going to be a lot more valuable in relation to paper currencies a few years hence.
China is coming very quickly, having world-class gold reserve holdings. And I believe right now, my personal opinion, is they're closer to 2,000 to 3,000 tons that they've got. I know the official growth rate per year is now 1,000. So the United States apparently has 8,300 tons, never audited. And Germany, that has about 3,400 tons resident in primarily the New York Federal Reserve, again, and Britain had never been audited. But it would, what stops China in another year or two, John, from saying its currencies or a consortium of countries that the BRICS or whatever, they can be a gold-backed currency, and suddenly there's a real alternative to the U.S. reserve currency. Is that a possibility?
Oh, it's a very real possibility. It would be an instant change in the framework of reserve currencies out there, because all of a sudden you would have one big currency that was used in a lot of different trade out there, which China's also doing. They're starting to use their currency for global trade rather than just for domestic use, and it would be backed by gold, whereas the rest of the paper currencies in the world would just be based on they'd be backed by our faith in the legitimacy of those governments and the competence of those governments. And gold is a lot more attractive than the competence of the Federal Reserve.
So, John, we have the BRIC countries. Brazil, as I just said, has doubled in the last 3 months. We know India is a major gold consumer. We've got China growing at the rates we're talking. We know Russia is one of the major accumulators of gold. And now we've got these international petrodollar agreements being signed amongst countries like China and Russia, et cetera. We've talked about 11 major agreements. Iran's putting in a bourse to sell its oil to these countries not using U.S. dollars. So we're on a cusp of a potential, I'm speculating, of a potential moment where it may be just like a switch. And these countries say, no, we're no longer going to play this fiat hot money game, and by the way, forcing us to debase our currency, and we're going to do a partial gold back, and the world will change in an instant. In the U.S., you want to know what hyperinflation is in the U.S. or the G7, you'd have it.
Well, the way imbalances work is they build up and they build up and they build up, and then one day everybody recognizes the imbalances and everything changes. And so, as you said, it could happen like flipping a switch, where all of a sudden the whole world decides that they don't want dollars and euros and yen anymore, and they want these other currencies that are backed by something tangible. And that could happen in a heartbeat. But in the meantime, the old order will continue. The imbalances will keep building up in the background. We won't really notice it. We won't see it in the mainstream media, but they will keep building up. And that's why you and I and a lot of other people are so pessimistic about the developed world right now, because the imbalances are clearly building up and they're clearly leading to something big. And in day-to-day life, we don't notice it yet, but it's happening out there. The numbers are getting more and more extreme, and let this go on for another 5 years with China accumulating gold at this rate and the U.S. and the other Western countries leasing their gold out. So therefore, losing gold from their official reserves that they can't get back. And you'll see a sea change. At some point it'll just change.
I think, John, my speculation of how this will change, it won't be a decision or a plan, though we could speculate there would be. It's this complexity we were talking about. Something's going to break. There will be a fracture. There will be a major crisis that will suddenly loom and will take the world with it. It'll be a Lehman-like moment. What will happen in the midst of that as it's going on to create stability? You will see China or BRIC defend themselves, and then it'll trigger them making this kind of move I'm talking about, because right now it's not in their best interest to do it. Their best interest is a slow, methodical transition. Otherwise, they're shooting themselves in the foot. And that's the standoff, the game that's being played. But when something breaks, and it will break, that's what'll trigger it. And it'll be something they don't really want to do, but they'll feel forced to do it because of the social unrest and unemployment that they will have within their countries. It's just pure speculation, John.
Yeah, I don't think we should see what they're doing as aggression against the developed countries.
I see it as survival.
They're preparing for what they see coming and what they can't really affect. They can't stop us from destroying the value of our currencies. We're the ones who are borrowing huge amounts of money and not prioritizing and creating huge amounts of new currency in order to finance our debts. We're doing all that. And China and Brazil and Russia are kind of bystanders. So they have a choice of being victimized by this or trying to defend themselves against it. And just like individual investors who are out there buying gold and silver coins now, these guys are accumulating real assets because they know those things will be valuable later and they'll be somewhat protected. They're not going to come through unscathed. If we go down, to an extent, we take the rest of the world down with us. But the least affected by all this will be the people who own hard assets that go up in value. And China and Russia and Brazil, they want to be in that crowd, not in the France and Germany's who end up being victimized by what's happening.
John, we're up against our hard line as always. Boy, time goes by fast. Any last points that you'd like to make in recapping 2012 that we haven't touched on that are important to you?
Well, 2012 was really a setup year. We let all the imbalances that are out there grow even larger. And as we enter 2013, we've kind of got a crisis of some kind baked into the cake. All our policy options have narrowed to just monetary ease. That's all that's left. We don't have any kind of real fiscal policy options left, and we certainly don't have any kind of deleveraging options left that are in any way painless or politically palatable. So what we're going to see next year is basically an attempt at inflating our way out of all this. And so in that sense, 2013 is a lot more clear than 2012 was, because now our choices have narrowed to the point where we're just going to do one thing. And all the central banks of the world have pretty much agreed that they're going to ease like crazy. And so that gives us a fairly clear investment thesis going forward, which is nice because we haven't had one for a few years now. So it looks like loading up on things like precious metals and other hard assets will probably pay off during the coming year in a way that it hasn't in the last couple of years.
John, we're going to be back right in the first part of the new year, and we're actually going to talk about our 2013 themes and what you see coming. And I'm really looking forward to that session. So best of the season to you, and I hope 2012 was a great investment year, and I hope 2013 is going to be a good one for all of us.
Great. Thanks, Gordon.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Okay.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through